They said he could remove the soul's rot with a scalpel. That sign, if charted through enough blood and tissue, would reveal itself like a tumor, and that a man of steady hand and divine insight could cut it out, not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically slice it from the flesh. That was the claim Dr. Wilhelm Ludwig made in the high country of Montana in 1882, where roads were still dirt veins through pine and snow, and where faith often collided with desperation. By the time his final patient was carried from the crude stone church he'd converted into an operating theater, no one in the county would say his name aloud, not in prayer, not in accusation, not even in confession. There are no surviving photographs of Dr. Ludwig himself, only the instruments he left behind, rusting in a locked drawer at St. Mary's Museum in Helena. Even those were found buried beneath a collapsed floorboard, sealed in a tin lined with old hymns and powdered bone. The church, of course, is long gone, burned down in 1883 during a blizzard no one ever confirmed with weather records, but the grave markers behind where it stood, crooked and half swallowed by earth, still read names of people the census never recorded. Some are labeled only with words like wrath or lust carved where surnames should have been. That's where we begin, with the idea that a man might believe sin could be found not in the heart or mind, but behind the ribcage, that shame was locatable, and that morality, or what someone mistook for it, could be enforced by scalpel. Dr. Ludwig arrived from Vienna with a forged American license and an offer few in Montana's dry frontier could refuse. He was educated, articulate, and spoke with a priest's reverence, if not a priest's restraint. By spring of that year, he'd already performed dozens of surgeries no one else dared name. They called him the Angel of the Vein, but only in whispers. In truth, most patients never spoke of what he did once the door closed, and those who did, well, most didn't live long enough to repeat it. What he called excision of transgression wasn't recorded in any medical journals. Instead, he kept a leather-bound ledger, now lost, where each case was described in coded anatomical shorthand, but scraps of pages found in the creek behind the church hinted at something darker. Subject 12. Sin of envy. One page read, presents with tightness in thorax, recurring thoughts of fratricide. Incision made along clavicle, extraction successful. Vocal cords removed to prevent recontamination. Another entry, less intact, mentioned baptismal incisions and a process referred to as sanctified bleeding. For Ludwig, pain wasn't a side effect, it was a component of the cure. No one quite knows how he gained the trust of the Ashcroft family, one of the few landowning settlers in the area, known for their private chapel and intense Calvinist views. But within weeks, the Ashcroft children became regular clients, and the oldest daughter Bethany stopped attending church altogether. Rumors spread that she had been caught writing notes in German, not prayers but diagrams of anatomy, of surgical restraint. Neighbors began reporting distant screams, not the usual animal howls from the wilderness, but something guttural, human, and repetitive. People said the air around the chapel changed. Horses refused to approach the gate. The snow lingered longer on that hill than anywhere else. When spring came, flowers bloomed black near the chapel's entrance. Not a metaphor, not hysteria. Black tulips, imported by Ludwig himself. He called them flowers of forgetfulness. They said the youngest Ashcroft child, James, age 11, went missing around this time. His body was never found, but neighbors remembered a child-sized pine box being carried into the church late one evening long after sunset. No service was held, no grave was marked, but days later Dr. Ludwig announced a breakthrough in his technique, a way to reopen the vessel without scarring the soul. By that summer, 5 more patients were treated. 4 of them died. 1 lived, if you can call it that. His name was Everett Cleary, a butcher's son with a history of rage. According to a letter found in his mother's attic decades later, Everett was taken to Ludwig to have his anger removed. What returned was not Everett. The boy didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't sleep. He only stood by the window, mouthing silent words as though remembering instructions. 3 weeks later, he sliced open his own chest in the family barn carefully, surgically, and stuffed the cavity with pages from a German Bible. No one called for Ludwig after that, but no one confronted him either. He remained in the chapel, rarely seen, never aging, always writing. People believed, or perhaps hoped, he had gone mad and was operating only on himself. Then, in January of 1883, during one of the worst storms Montana had seen in 20 years, the chapel burned to the ground. Not a single footprint was found in the snow, yet the surgical table remained intact, and the ledger had been opened to a page marked only with the phrase, "Sin cannot be cured, but it can be silenced." There was a rumor that Dr. Ludwig had once been expelled from a Catholic seminary in Austria, not for heresy, but for something much worse. Something so deeply buried in the archives that even his surname was scratched from the official roster. Some claimed he had tried to perform surgery during confession, that he demanded the removal of organs as penance, that he believed he could see a man's sin in the twitch of his pupils, or the rhythm of his breath, that he considered the 10 Commandments not rules of behavior, but diagnosed his immoral anatomy. When he fled Europe, he carried no luggage, only a single wooden box lined with crimson velvet, the same color as the velvet curtain he later hung inside the Montana chapel. It wasn't placed over the pulpit or in any ceremonial corner. It hung just above the entrance to his operating theater. It was the last thing every patient saw before the anesthesia. A kind of warning, or a promise. People in the nearby mining towns began to speak of a man who carved sins out of the body, and like all whispered things, it spread, not loudly, it never needed to. Those who carried shame carried it everywhere, even across frozen rivers and dirt trails. It was a woman from Kalispell who arrived first, face gaunt, pregnant, and desperate. Her brother claimed she had slept with a priest and feared her soul was blackening from the inside. When she left the chapel 3 days later, she was no longer pregnant. No body was buried. She spoke only in mutters. Her hands trembled violently. 3 months after returning home, she set fire to her own bed and sat calmly in the flames until they consumed her. Others followed. A boy who had stolen from his dying father. A schoolteacher accused of touching a child's hair too long. A widow who confessed to poisoning her husband. They all believed what Ludwig offered was not medicine, but purification, that he wasn't a doctor, but something older, something surgical and sacred. They crawled to him with wounds you couldn't see, and he opened them anyway. The townspeople refused to interfere. Most were too afraid, or worse, they believed. And belief, when mixed with guilt and silence, becomes a kind of fog, one that lets horror walk freely in daylight. But not everyone looked away. Sheriff Henry Callum, an old Civil War veteran with a jaw like cracked leather and eyes yellowed from drink, finally visited the chapel one April morning after a child was found wandering the woods, bloodied and dazed. She said her mother had taken her to the doctor to get the wicked out. Her abdomen was stitched poorly, not by a professional, not even by Ludwig himself, it seemed. There was no record of her ever being admitted, no file, no name. Sheriff Callum brought 2 deputies with him. Only one returned. The other, Daniel Hoyt, aged 25, engaged to be married, entered the chapel's back room and never came out. When they finally forced the door open, there was no body, only a coat, folded neatly beside a basin filled with what looked like rainwater, but smelled of bleach and bile. Ludwig was arrested, briefly. He said nothing during the questioning. Not a word. He stared forward unblinking even as the sheriff described the testimonies, even as he held up the blood-stained cloth they found beneath the chapel floorboards. And then, on the 3rd night in the jail, the sheriff vanished. The door was still locked from the inside. The key was still in his coat. His gun had not been fired, but his cell was empty. And Ludwig was sitting calmly in the same chair, smiling now. A tight, dry smile that didn't touch the eyes. When questioned, he said only he asked to be healed. There was no trial, no execution. Just a quiet decision to release him, not for lack of evidence, but because no one in town would testify, not a single soul. The townspeople had seen what happened to those who opposed the doctor, and those who supported him. They still bore their own stitches. From that point on, Ludwig was left alone in the chapel. But the visits never stopped. People came at night, cloaked in shawls, led by secrets, and they left different. Not better, not worse, just altered. They walked slower, they blinked less, they answered questions with silence. It was around this time that Ludwig wrote what became known as the Doctrine of Flesh, a crude hand-bound volume found decades later in a locked drawer at the Helena Diocesan Archives. It described, in clinical detail, the 7 anatomical scenes: lust in the tongue, greed in the hands, wrath in the spleen. Each sin, he argued, had a home in the human body, and if one could locate it by surgery, by scripture, by suffering, it could be removed. But sin, he warned, was not singular. You could remove it once, but it always tried to return. He compared it to cancer, a recurrent, something that grows again in secret places if left untreated, and if the body could not contain the removal, then the body must be discarded. People read this with horror, years later, but at the time, no one saw the book, no one except his patients. And one of them was the governor's son. It was the summer of 1883 when young Jonathan Renshaw was sent to stay in the mountains. Officially, it was for recuperation, though no one ever confirmed what he was recovering from. The boy was 17, thin as reed stalk, and pale in that way only Eastern aristocracy could be. Not sickly, exactly, but untouched. He had the look of someone who'd been kept inside too long, shielded from dust, from bruises, from consequence. His father, Governor Edwin Renshaw of Helena, was a man known for precision and politics, but his son had always been a problem. And when the boy was accused of a shameful trespass against a housemaid, a woman who vanished just days later, the scandal threatened to unravel an entire re-election campaign. The family physician claimed it was a moral affliction and recommended temporary exile. It was Reverend Malcolm Trost, a friend of the governor and quiet benefactor of Ludwig's chapel, who suggested the mountain retreat. He said the doctor was not a healer of wounds, but a mender of souls. And so, with no trial, no court, no consequence, Jonathan Renshaw was sent to the care of Dr. Wilhelm Ludwig. He arrived on a cloudy Monday and was not seen again for 3 months. No telegrams, no letters, not a single piece of mail. Only silence, until, in mid-September, a note arrived in Helena, handwritten, elegant, not from Ludwig but from Jonathan himself. The message was short. Father, the stain is gone. He showed me what I really am. I am staying. Do not come. It was a signature that disturbed the governor most, not the handwriting, which was clearly Jonathan's, but the name he signed beneath it. Jonathan Renshaw Ludwig. The press never got the letter. The public never knew. And still, the governor's carriage left Helena that very night, under cover of darkness. Escorted by 2 guards and a priest, they never reached the chapel. 3 days later, the carriage was found overturned beside a ravine. All 4 horses dead, skulls crushed, 1 guard missing. The priest's throat slit, and the governor himself was discovered crawling along the bank, fingers torn from clawing at the rocks, whispering a single word again and again. Sown, sown, sown. They brought him back to Helena strapped to a stretcher. He never stood, again never spoke. Only stared, eyes wide, red-rimmed, fixated on some shape that only he could see. A month later, he bit through his own wrist artery during evening prayer and died before the nurse noticed. As for Jonathan, he was never seen again. But in the spring thaw of 1884, a hunter found a boy's suit folded neatly on a tree stump 20 miles east of the chapel. Beneath it, a small wooden carving. The shape was rough, unfinished, but unmistakable. A heart, with stitches. By now, the legend of Dr. Ludwig had curdled. No longer whispered with reverence, now with dread. Children were warned not to speak his name. Locals crossed themselves when riding past the old stone trail, and still, every few weeks someone made the climb. A grieving mother, a hollow-eyed preacher, a woman dragging her drunken husband by the collar. It was no longer about healing, it was about guilt, and what people were willing to lose to escape it. Because guilt is heavier than death, and some would rather trade the body than carry the soul. Then came the summer of drought, no rain, no breeze, just stillness. The crops yellowed, livestock starved. Tempers grew brittle. People began blaming the mountains, saying it had become cursed, that Ludwig had taken too much, that the land was rejecting him, rejecting them. Then one night, the chapel caught fire. Witnesses from the mining camp saw it, flames licking out of the bell tower, thick black smoke pouring like ink into the stars. They claimed the fire raged for hours, but when they arrived, in the morning the building was untouched, not a single scorch mark. The bell still hung silent. The stone, cool to the touch, but there was something new. A large red circle had been painted over the chapel door, the kind used in old world quarantines, a warning, or a seal, and next to it, nailed crudely into the wooden frame, was a single sentence written in dried blood. Do not open the body if you cannot withstand the sign. No one confessed to writing it. No one knew who placed it there. But from that day on, no one entered the chapel again, except for one man, a drifter, name unknown. He walked barefoot, clothed in burlap, with wrists covered in burn scars, and a smile that never quite reached the eyes. He knocked on the chapel door at midnight. They say Ludwig answered. Neither man was ever seen again, but the air around mountain changed, thicker, hungrier, as if something had been buried, not just underground, but in the very sky. They would not discover the journals until decades later. It was 1929 when a crew of loggers accidentally uncovered a crawl space beneath the abandoned chapel. The structure had collapsed in on itself over the years, buried by rock slides and forgotten by time. But when one of the men struck something hollow with his axe and heard the echo beneath the floor, they unearthed a narrow passage, lined with rusted medical tools and brick walls. Scrawled in Latin. The air inside hadn't moved in 40 years. They went no farther than 20 feet before turning back. One of the men, a seasoned logger, ex-military, refused to speak for 3 days. When he did, he said only this: they were praying backwards, that's all I'll say. The site was sealed and quietly handed over to the Montana Historical Society, who deemed it of sensitive cultural value, but not before 2 books were recovered. Leatherbound, stitched by hand, labeled only with initials burned into the front cover, W.L. Dr. Wilhelm Ludwig's journals. They remain unpublished to this day. The originals are housed in a climate-controlled vault in Helena, under restricted access, but photocopies, poor ones, degraded and yellowed, leaked out years ago, passed between theologians, historians, and eventually the kinds of people who don't believe in accident, the ones who believe certain knowledge was never meant to be buried, that the entries inside don't read like medical notes, they read like sermons. Long breathless passages about spiritual incision, about extracting the rot of the soul by mechanical separation. There are references to ancient monastic orders, to flagellants, to Gnostic bloodlines. He speaks of internal blasphemy as if it were a tumor. He refers to guilt as a parasitic twin, and repeatedly, obsessively, Ludwig refers to his patients not by name, but by sin. The woman of envy, the boy of cruelty, the husband of lust. He refers to them as if they had been transformed, no longer patients, but vessels. And each entry ends the same way, a kind of ritualistic postscript. The flesh remembers what the spirit tries to forget. cut deep, so clean. And then came the final entry. It is dated December 19th, 1882. The handwriting is uneven, spidery. It begins in German, then drifts into broken Latin, and finally collapses into almost incoherent English. But the meaning is unmistakable. The last patient, too, is myself. I have located the source of my own sin behind the ribs, in the false warmth of the heart. It is clever, this parasite. It mimics conscience, but it is only hunger. Today I will cut it out. There will be no nurse, no anesthetic, no prayer. If I do not return, let no one repeat this practice. The soul, once exposed, does not forget the light. God help me if it has a name. That was the last known writing of Wilhelm Ludwig. No grave was ever found. No death certificate issued, no body recovered, but in 1934, a prospector hiking near the ruins found something half buried in the ash-gray soil, a silver surgical scalpel, engraved with a Latin phrase, Pacitum est vitae, sin is alive. The handle was warm to the touch. He left it where he found it. In the years since, stories have spread about hikers disappearing in that part of the mountains, about bodies found with their chests sliced open. Surgical precision, no sign of it struggled, always the same wound, a neat vertical line right where the sternum meets the heart, but never any blood. One park ranger who surveyed the region in the 1970s kept a map on his wall with tiny red pins stuck into the trees. He retired early, moved to New Mexico, and left a note behind that said simply, "They're not buried, they're still beating." To this day, there are those who swear the mountain hums at night. Not a natural sound, not wind, not earth shifting, but something else, a vibration, like breath caught in the throat, and sometimes, on the coldest mornings, hikers say they can hear it beneath their feet. Not footsteps, a heartbeat. It was a priest who gave the last warning. In 1982, a Jesuit scholar named Father Elias Vermont petitioned to access the Ludwig journals as part of his doctoral research on pre-Vatican II heresies. He had studied the manuscripts that had leaked, over the years translated them, annotated them, even written a private thesis under lock and key. When he received access to the original journals at Helena, he spent just 2 hours alone in the archive. Then he vanished. They found his rental car still idling in the parking lot, door ajar, rosary draped over the steering wheel. He had signed into the archive but never signed out. But there was one thing left behind, a note he had scribbled onto a torn piece of library stationery, folded and tucked between the pages of volume I. It read, "You do not operate on sin, you confess it." That's the difference between a surgeon and a priest. One believes he can cure it, the other knows he never can. Father Vermont's disappearance is officially unsolved, but in 1991, a forensic technician reviewing backlog from an unrelated investigation was digitizing old crime scene photos. One image, taken from a remote hiking trail near the site of the former chapel ruins, shows a barely visible figure standing at the tree line, tall, narrow, hunched, not facing the camera, not moving, wearing a long dark coat. The image was time-stamped exactly 100 years to the day after Dr. Ludwig's final JOURNAL entry. What haunts experts most isn't the figure's size or its shadowed form. It's the thing visible at its side, not quite a bag, not quite a tool belt, but a glint of metal, silver-shaped like a scalpel. Some say Ludwig never died. Others say he succeeded, that he found the sin, cut it out, and it lived. That something parasitic, once trapped in the heart of a man, had been made into flesh, that had learned how to walk upright, that it learned the motions of speech and ritual, that it mimicked penitence long enough to escape the knife, and became the knife itself. Some believed Ludwig was mad, a product of trauma and isolation and warped theology, but those who read the journals really read them say otherwise. They say his notes had a consistency that madness never achieves, a logic that unfolded too perfectly, and they say there are truths in his work too terrible to be invented. Descriptions of surgeries that match no known procedure, yet correspond precisely with unexplainable postmortems from bodies found across western Montana, southern Idaho, and even parts of Nevada and Utah. All with one thing in common, an incision above the heart, a cavity left untouched and no trace of blood. Local superstition holds that the mountain never truly let Ludwig leave, that whatever evil he tried to cut out found another way to live, not just through flesh, but through memory, through retelling, that the idea of cutting out sin became a kind of ritual, a virus passed down from patient to reader, reader to listener, that by hearing his story, some small part of you begins to itch behind your ribs, begins to wonder what lies curled just beneath the breastbone, begins to wonder if your worst parts aren't choices, but growths. And the question Ludwig left unanswered, the one that makes the silence roar louder than any scream, was never what if we could remove sin. It was, what if sin is the only part of us that lives forever? The final page of the recovered manuscript contains no words, only a crude drawing, a ribcage split open, and a second ribcage beneath it, smaller, fused, alive. It was signed not with initials but with a symbol, a scalpel piercing a heart and growing roots.